For being with us today. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, Institute of International Affairs, and the Director of the Institute Program on Multilateralism and Global Governance. Let me first of all invite all of you to turn off your microphone. Of course, after the introductory presentations during the Q&A, you will be able to take the floor to make comments and ask questions. The subject that we want to discuss this morning are the impact of digitalization, digital transformation, and the related governance challenges, with a special focus on the role of the G20. So essentially on what the G20 can do to promote collective responses to the challenges of digitalization. And we know that those challenges are multidimensional and multifaceted, so are particularly complex and need to be discussed comprehensively. This meeting is indeed part of a wider project entitled The Role of G20 in Promoting Global Governance, Challenges and Opportunities of the Italian Presidency of the G20. The goal of the project is essentially to examine the state of play of the G20 agenda and try to make recommendations and proposals that may help the Italian government, the Prime Ministerial Office and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation to advance the G20 agenda during the Italian presidency of next year, which no doubt will be high on the agenda, on the foreign policy agenda of the Italian government. So let me express in this regard a special thanks to our partners, in particular the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Compagnia di Sanpaolo of Turin for not only supporting the project, but also for interacting and cooperating closely with us in defining the project research agenda and its main initiative, and also, of course, help us implement them. In agreement with the Italian government, we have chosen to concentrate on 4 issues, which figure, as you know, prominently in the G20 agenda, of course, among others. The first is the governance of international trade and the reform of WTO. Second, aging and the challenges of aging. Third is circular economy, and the fourth is digital transformation. For each of these topics, we are organizing a seminar. So this seminar is part of a series of meetings aimed at discussing specific issues of our research agenda. We held a meeting on trade last week, and we are now planning to organize 2 additional meetings on the other topics I have mentioned in the autumn, and then a final conference where we want to address, perhaps with a more comprehensive approach, the implication of the COVID-19 epidemic and how the actual and potential role of the G20 is changing as a result of the impact, the far-reaching impact of the sanitary crisis. So I would like to thank the experts who have accepted to serve as panelists. Of course, in this meeting, we are so keen to discuss how the digital transformation has been impacted by the COVID-19 epidemic. But more broadly, we intend to address the main challenges of the governance of digitalization, taking into account the most recent initiatives undertaken at the international level, and particularly within the G20, we deny to the role also, I think, that the European Union, the EU, can play, how the EU diplomacy can contribute concretely to this effort. The key question is, I think, if there is room for convergence among the main actors and stakeholders, in particular the members of G20, to introduce new rules and measures that can make it possible an effective management of digital transformation. And this includes its impact on economic development, labor markets, privacy and human rights, standardization and regulation of technological advances. As I said, our project includes a research component. A paper for each of the subjects I have mentioned has been drafted by a leading expert. These papers are all now ready for publication, or almost ready for publication, and I think will be out in the coming weeks. And I wish to thank Paul Tony, who is with us today and will make one of the introductory presentations for drafting the paper on digital transformation for our project. Paul is from the Center for International Governance Innovation, CG, a well-known Canadian center, which in the last few years, I would like to underline, has been able to develop a comprehensive, very large project on digitalization, and also traditionally for many years has been very active in studying and examining the agenda of the G20. In this context, we have cooperated on several projects, have been constantly in contact, particularly to discuss the agendas of the G7 and G20. So let me also again express our deepest thanks on behalf of the Institute to the other panelists who are all prominent experts who have accepted to serve as panelists. And now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Armando Barucco, head of the analysis and planning unit of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Armando, the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, Ettore, but I actually said a lot of what I wanted to say in the previous meeting, so I will be very brief. And thank you very much, of course, to Yai for the excellent work that has been done so far on all the subjects related to the preparation of the G20 presidency. I would say that you confronted, like all of us, but you are actually confronted with a very difficult task, which is actually keeping the focus on the main trends and development and everything that is related to the role that the G20 can have on several issues that are actually essential for our future. At the same time, like all of us, trying to understand the new context and adapt to the new context. Otherwise, the whole discussion will be a discussion like Alice in Wonderland that tries to understand what's going on, and the rest of the world is completely different and changing around there. So I thank you very much, because I think you have managed actually to take into account of these two needs. And on the subject and on the paper of Paul Twomey, I just want to say that I think it's extremely interesting because he managed actually to take into account of the two issues, and he is actually reflecting on some of the intersection in which digitalization and the future of work has actually intersected with what is happening in these days. And I will just remember some of them, you know, the crisis, the pending crisis, economic crisis and depression, and then actually the role that digitalization can play in terms positive and negative. And then, of course, the whole issue about authoritarianism, versus democracy, and the kind of instruments, tools that digitalization can actually give, both positive and negative in this respect. And then finally, of course, and from that point of view, of course, all the issues related to cybersecurity and security and to the kind of exposure that, in particular, some sectors of our economy or public administration are confronted with the digitalization. I have to do some smart working like most of us. And I have to use, of course, connection, whose level of safety is actually somehow disputable. But at the same time, I have an obligation to work from my house. So finally, and this is related actually very much to the debate that we are having with the Huawei and the 5G technologies, etc., the whole issue of the public versus private and the changing balance in certain decision between the vision of the state as a regulator and the state as an entrepreneur. And some decision, even related to the work of private companies and infrastructure that are essential for the work of private companies, are becoming more and more a matter of public debate and the responsibility of public administration. And I will stay here because I think I've spoken even too much. And thank you very much for the excellent work that you are doing.
Many thanks, Armando. And now the floor goes to my colleague, Nicola Pilotta, who is part of our research team on the G20 agenda, and he will be chairing and moderating our meeting.
Thank you, Ettore, and a very warm welcome to everybody, to our speakers and to our participants. It's my pleasure to, first of all, give the floor to Nicolas Pinot, Sherpa at the OECD, who is gonna give a keynote speech and is gonna describe how digitalization is impacting our economy and our society. Nicolas, if you can share your screen so we can see your presentation, I leave the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Greco, to you, Nicola, for this very kind invitation. It's a great opportunity to address such a distinguished audience. Yes, I'm the OECD Sherpa. I'm therefore following the G20 very closely, including this the digital agenda of the G20. I've been following the G20 for quite a few years now. So my presentation will first of all try to give a sense of how we see the digital transformation that our societies and economies are undergoing right now, but also to give you a sense also about the discussion in the G20 about the digital transformation which is ongoing. So obviously this discussion, as the previous speakers have underlined, is taking place in the very specific context with the COVID crisis. And the OECD released a month ago its latest economic outlook, which shows how complex the economic situation is. We project global GDP to decline by 6% this year globally, in the context of a single hit scenario. So only one wave of the pandemics, but in fact, this decline in GDP could reach up to 7–8% if there is a second wave. These are by far the largest declines that the OECD has ever forecast in its 60-year history. So it helps. And of course, in this context, the digital technologies and the evolving business models and work practices have been absolutely essential. They have prevented our economies and societies from going into complete standstill. AI technologies alone, they have played a key role in every aspect of the COVID-19 crisis response, from detecting and diagnosing the virus, predicting its evolution, even slowing the virus spread through surveillance and contact tracing. And it will also provide the instruments to monitor the recovery and improve early warning tools. So if we look ahead, it is again the digital economy that emerges as the cornerstone for an inclusive and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, but provided that we implement the right policies. And in fact, this COVID crisis has been a sort of magnifier of trends and structural changes that were already at play before the crisis, obviously. So let me precisely give an illustration of these structural changes that were at play before the crisis. A few pointers to illustrate the growing importance of the digital economy. At first, data. Data flows are obviously at the heart of the functioning of the digital economy, and as such, their evolution provides a particularly striking example of the increasing use of digital technologies by private and public actors alike, and of the rising interconnectedness of our economies. And you can see from the chart on this slide, both panels, first of all, the rise in the global internet traffic that has grown exponentially since 2006. And on the right panel, the rising number of internet users. In just 7 years, the share of internet users in Italy has gone from slightly above 20% of the population to more than 60%, while it reached 80% in France. Also, it's above 90% in countries like South Korea or the UK. But the digital economy is not just about internet connection. It is much broader. It includes developments such as robots, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, or even blockchain. And these technologies are actually increasingly permeating our economies and the world of work. It's redefining the business model, the workplaces, the way we trade, the way we communicate. And if we look at the orders of industrial robots over the past decade, they have actually tripled. So in this context, there is a lot of discussions on whether this increased digitalization of the economy will create unemployment and will destroy jobs and will replace workers. This is not a new discussion, as you know. This dates back to, in particular, the 19th century movement like Ludism, for instance. But in fact, what we are seeing is that employment rates in most OECD countries have actually been on an upward trend. And why? This is because jobs are actually being created at a faster rate than they are being destroyed, and greater opportunities are opening up to participate in the labor market for many people who were formerly excluded from the labor market. And this has actually been very well documented, not only by the OECD, but by a number of economists, such as Bessen, Autor, Acemoglu, and Restrepo, among others. So that's really for this discussion on the impact of digitalization on the overall number of jobs. And then we will see that obviously there are issues related to displacement, technological displacement, which can be indeed problematic. On top of the opportunities that I just presented, the crisis has also highlighted how fundamental to our economy and society digital technologies have become. The digital economy enhances the resilience of many economic activities, including through the digitalization of business models. We've seen this in the crisis. the uptake of teleworking. It ensured the provision of many public services during the lockdown. And there are obvious examples: health, education, with schools moving to fully online courses, and the development of e-medicine in response to sanitary obligation. But these examples, digital tools in the form of AI, is also being leveraged to support the global quest for a vaccine and other medical appliances. And the chart on the left side of this slide is an illustration of how AI is leveraged precisely for the development of vaccines. On the right, what we see, and this is another metrics of this intensive use of digital technology, is really the importance of digital tools during the crisis for communication. And we've seen in the crisis a soaring demand for broadband communication services, with some operators experiencing as much as a 60% increase in internet traffic. But obviously, there are opportunities, but there is always, in a sort of a dialectic manner, risk and challenges attached to those opportunities. And in fact, when we look at the uptake of digital technologies, what we see is that this uptake is extremely uneven and remain uneven, because not all technologies are actually equally well diffused, as you can see in particular on the left chart. In OECD countries, while broadband is indeed mostly accessible to all firms, the rate of penetration of more sophisticated e-processes remain slightly above 40% in the case of big data, but it barely reaches 10% otherwise. So SMEs tend to have a much lower uptake of digital tools than larger firms. To give you an idea, in Italy, for instance, almost half of the largest firms use cloud computing services. This is above the OECD average of 47%, while only 20% of the smallest firms use these technologies, which is slightly below the OECD average of 22%. But it shows really the divergence and the uneven diffusion of digital technologies between the small and the larger firms. And of course, this risks creating and reinforcing inequalities. In particular, in the COVID crisis, what we've seen is that it quickly translated into a deep divide and an unequal capacity across firms to respond to the sudden need for going digital. Many firms tried to go digital during the crisis, but their SMEs, many SMEs were not equipped to do so, and their workers could not actually go digital and telework and be fully operational during the crisis. And in fact, SMEs are, which were already lacking both advanced digital equipment and high digital skills across their employees before the crisis, they were actually disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. And in fact, this unequal access to innovation and technology is translated into a widening productivity gap across firms. And there at the OECD, we've done quite a bit of research on how to account for the fact that what we see at the macro level is in fact a slowdown in productivity. In fact, when we look at macro data at firm level, what we see is indeed a widening gap between a group of frontier firms, firms that are really the front runners in terms of innovation, in terms of digitalization, in terms of technological progress. It's a small group, mostly big firms, but not only. Sometimes you have also small, very innovative firms. And this group is recording high productivity gains, but the rest of the firms, the bulk of the firms, is actually lagging behind. And this explains somehow the fact that what we have seen, despite tremendous technological progress over the last 2-3 decades is that we don't see it in the macro data when it comes to the productivity gains. And this is very much similar to the famous productivity paradox of Robert Solow a few decades ago. We have computers everywhere, but we don't see them in the statistics. But that's a bit the problem. And in fact, it's only a paradox that it's not a real paradox. In fact, when you look at the macro data, you understand why. And in fact, the lack of diffusion of technology explain the lack of diffusion of innovation, of technology across firms, explain this widening gap. And the lack of diffusion of technology is itself related to the structures of the economy, and notably the dynamics of competition. And obviously, one big issue which is on everybody's mind is the lack of competition, the trend towards concentration in a number of economic sectors, and in particular in the ICT incentive sectors. And there again, there is a large body of evidences in the economic literature. Furman and Orzag, Autor, Shapiro, and ourselves at the OECD, we've looked at different metrics, either market concentration ratio, Hirschman and Fidel index, markup, churns, and what we see is a rising concentration of firms and activity and profits in certain sectors, not only ICT, it can be also the pharmaceutical sector, it can be the finance, but it's true that this rise of concentration is particularly salient in ICT intensive sectors. And this is, we know why, because there is certain characteristic attached to the ICT sector, to the digital economy, which explain this tendency towards concentration. It has to do with network effects, with scale without mass, with massive economies of scale, with the importance of intangible assets as well, intellectual property, algorithms, software, data, which are indispensable to compete effectively. And in that context, you have this sort of winner takes most dynamics at play that can explain both rising concentration and this widening productivity gap across firms. There are also so there are inequalities among firms. There are also inequalities among people, among workers. And at the OECD, we have tried to estimate, I was referring to technological progress and unemployment. We have tried to estimate the percentage of jobs which are at risk of automation. And we, through a very granular task-based analysis, which is in fact inspired from a seminal article from Frey and Osborne in 2013, we try really to assess the percentage of jobs that are at risk of automation. And what we see is that 14% of existing jobs and occupations could disappear as a result of automation in the next 15, 20 years, meaning that the likelihood of those jobs to be automated is higher than 70%. And 32% are likely to, of jobs are likely to change dramatically, meaning that their probability of being automated is between 50 and 70%, with most of their tasks to be automated. And there again, not everybody is equal in the face of digitalization, automation. In fact, the low-skilled and the low-income workers are those which are the most at risk of having their jobs automated. But there are also other divides, again, across, among people, across regions. There is a divide, a digital divide between rural and urban areas. There is obviously also a sort of gender digital divide on which we at the OECD, we have worked quite a bit. The global internet penetration rate is about 45% for women compared to 51% for men. This corresponds to having 250 million fewer women than men online. So it's pretty significant. There are also other challenges. I will only touch upon them very quickly because I don't have the time to elaborate on each of them. The first one is consumer trust. We have seen in OECD countries that the proportion of individuals who made an online purchase in 2017 was 52% higher was 52 up from 33.6% in 2009. So it's a pretty significant increase. But of course, obviously, all this is very contingent on consumer protection. What we have seen also is an increasing reports of unfair, misleading, and fraudulent commercial practices online, and this represents a serious threat to e-commerce, and in particular to the smaller businesses due to their managerial and financial resource constraints. The SMEs are really the firms that are the most susceptible, the most vulnerable to those risks of consumer fraud. There are also a couple of other issues which I need to touch on very quickly. The first is really the second, I would say, is data flows. Data ownership, and data localization. This is an issue which is very much on the international agenda because this is what determines really the interoperability of regulatory framework when it comes to the flows of data. And there, what it raises is really the fundamental nature of data. What is data? Is it a commodity just like anyone else? Or is data a special commodity? Because indeed, data can be personal. It contains information that should not or cannot be easily shared. So it raises issues around privacy, ownership, security, localization, and free flows of data. So there is a need really to better understand what data is, the different categories of data. And this is why at the OECD, we are currently undertaking a project on, we call it data on data. So really unpacking what data is and better understanding the various categories of data. There are data that are indeed personal, which indeed raise issues regarding, as I said, ownership and privacy, but there are also a lot of data that are exchanged, for instance, intra-firms, which are not at all raising the same kind of issues, and that could be exchanged across border much more easily, and which are indeed. So these are not exactly the same kind of issue, and this needs to be better understood. There are also issues around the governance of digital technologies, in particular the governance of big data analytics, algorithm, which is sometimes seen as a black box to the consumer, to market participants, with the risk of increasing bias and discrimination. And one obvious example is, for instance, a credit scoring algorithm. And there's changes in the regulatory framework should be considered, in particular focusing on investor and consumer protection and education, as well as financial inclusion. So these are some of the issues that that indeed the G20 is looking at, and considering the pervasiveness of the digital transformation. Obviously, the digital economy and the digital transformation should be one of the key items on the G20 agenda, and it has become, in fact, over the years, a significant priority for the G20. This emphasis of the G20 on the digitalization and innovation has actually started with the Chinese presidency in 2016, with the establishment of a task force on the digital economy by the Chinese presidency. They started with, they established a G20 blueprint on innovative growth. And then, in fact, this agenda was further developed by Germany in 2017, continued by Argentina in 2018, but really took a new dimension probably last year with the Japanese presidency, which came up with, you probably heard about this, the G20 AI principles. And these AI principles are actually themselves very much derived from principles, AI principles endorsed at the OECD a few months before that. This is probably a very good illustration of the kind of things that the G20 can do with an important policy agenda. The G20 adopted these principles as, and in fact, it was the first global intergovernmental instrument on AI, and it strives to, let's say, to promote an AI that is inclusive, that is sustainable, that is really human-centric, focused on the well-being of people, that puts at its center values such as human rights, but also democratic values, that is also transparent, explainable, and for which, in fact, the designers of AI technologies, algorithm, and so on, should be accountable. So it's really about security, transparency, accountability, and human-centric dimension of artificial intelligence. And it was a very important signal that the G20 sent to the broader policy community that it was caring about the sort of ethic dimension and policy dimension of the development of digital technology. The second big item on the agenda, which I mentioned, is data flows. This is obviously the big elephant in the room. Why? Because a lot of data are exchanged every day, but at the same time, what we see is a landscape of data flows which is very fragmented, which is almost balkanized, so to speak, with countries in the G20 which are coming from very distant positions between the European and with the GDPR, with the US, which have a much more, let's say, laissez-faire, laissez-passer kind of approach to data flows, and countries which are actually controlling very firmly data flows, such as Russia or China. And Japanese presidency last year and the Saudi presidency this year, they've tried to advance a discussion on how to promote what the Japanese call last year data-free flows with trust. So it's trying to square the circle. So data-free flows really being relatively close to the US position, allowing for the free flow of data, but with trust, putting a lot of emphasis at the same time on the issue of data ownership and data privacy. But as I say, it's a bit like squaring the circle. So if we look ahead, this year, digital was also a very important agenda for the Saudi presidency, with also the same discussion on data flows, but also the measurement of the digital economy, smart mobility, cyber security, the implementation of the AI principles endorsed under the Japanese presidency. So it remains an important agenda, but also still politically difficult to handle. If we look ahead with the Italian presidency, what should be, from an OECD perspective at least, the priorities? But first, really the inclusiveness of the digital economy. I mentioned several dimensions of this issue. There, indeed, access to technology, addressing the lack of investment in certain areas of the technological infrastructure should probably be a priority of the Italian presidency next year. And in fact, this uneven level of investment, depending on the regions and the areas, is partly due to the fact that private investment, which forms, in fact, the lion's share of investment in communication infrastructure, is in some instance not integrating well enough the longer term and broader view of social returns attached to investment in digital infrastructure. And this is something that the Italian presidency could consider. Obviously, there are also the issue of the digital financial inclusion, how to leverage think tank solutions to ease SME access to financing. This is the kind of digital financial solution that should be increase going forward. The Italian presidency could also look at the implementation of those AI principles, very much building on what the Saudis have done this year, looking, for instance, at how artificial intelligence could be leveraged for the implementation and the achievement of the SDGs. There are also issues related to blockchains. We are developing, as we did for artificial intelligence, blockchain principles to see how we can frame precisely an accountable, transparent, and human-centric use of blockchain. So these are some of the issues that that could be on the Italian agenda as well. The resilience of business model, thanks to the use of digital technologies, is something that will remain on the agenda in the post-COVID crisis for sure. And there again, the issue of enabling micro and small medium enterprises to fully embrace the digital economy will be key. And finally, this discussion on the data flows and data interoperability will remain the big international agenda. As I said, very difficult, complex, with lots of political divergences to be ironed out. But there again, I think the Italian presidency should really invest some significant political capital in trying to bridge the differences on this critical issue. So these are some of the issues that the Italian presidency may want to consider next year. And obviously the OECD will be happy to support with our expertise, with its expertise, those elements of a future agenda. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Nicolas for his interesting presentation, full already of insights. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to the panel. And we are gonna have Paul Twomey, Dishman Fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation, Marjorie Busher, Executive Director of Digital Society Initiative at Chatham House, Andrea Gumina, Senior Policy Advisor to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Andrea Renda, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and the Digital Economy at the CHEPS, Center for European Policy Studies, and finally, Maria Joao Rodriguez, President of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. So first of all, I'm gonna give the floor to Paul, who, as Ettore already mentioned, wrote a paper within the project we have organized this webinar in. And after, I'm gonna follow in alphabetic order. I'm gonna ask to our speakers to have the presentation up to 7 minutes. So we have some times for the Q&A session. And I also ask to participants, in case they have any question, to write them in the chat so I can keep track of the questions. And when we have the Q&A session, I will be able to collect already some of the questions and address them to the speakers. So with no further time, I'm gonna ask Paul to take the floor and carry out his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, and greetings, colleagues. Nice to meet so many people. Just quickly, I'm a very unusual distinguished fellow of a think tank. My background is that I was at McKinsey's, but then I was the deputy of the Australian Trade Commission, and I was the head of the Australian National Office for Information Economy. So I ran too much of the Australian bureaucracy involved in this area for a period of time. I then was the head of the government committee and then the CEO of ICANN, the body that coordinates the backbone infrastructure of the internet, at least the protocol part of it. I am a well-scarred veteran of the internet governance debates of the noughties. And then I'm now an entrepreneur who's actually founded 5 companies in this sort of general space, including one on biosecurity, one in cybersecurity, which have relationships using AI, etc. So I come with a sort of variety of backgrounds. And when I write and talk to this space, I'm, with all due respects to all academics, I'm not an academic in the sense that I come very much focusing on impact. And what I see from my background as being things that potentially could be changed. So in that context, there is a paper which I have written. I'm going to work on the assumption people who are on the list have got a chance to read that, or if they haven't, they will get a chance to read it with alacrity after this call. But let me just talk to some of the key parts to it, I think. Basically, the paper talks to four things. What is the state of international cooperation and position of the major actors? What are some of the initiatives undertaken in the G20? What's the impact of COVID-19? And then what do I see as potential role of the G20? And talking to that somewhat swiftly, the paper talks through quite a number of the international organizations that we have, and what's the nature of the discussion around digitalization, and particularly as it relates to also particularly to work and the future of work. I think the bottom line of all the international organizations is the big organizations that have large membership. So the UN and the ITU in particular, which have been, ITU of course has got a history in this space, especially in telecoms. I think you can summarize it down as that they have become major areas for geopolitical competition around the aspects of technology, essentially between what I would call the data liberals or the internet liberal states and the data sovereign states. That's overlaid with many other aspects. That division is also divisions in many other ways in international politics that I don't need to tell this audience. I should make a note, when I was at ICANN, I worked quite closely with the Italian Foreign Ministry and also with Minister Stanca, who was then Minister of Innovation and Technology. So I know how much attention Rome's paid to these issues. So, you know, clearly there's a split in the UN context. The GGE, the Group of Government Experts on Cybersecurity, has been a good case in point. The most recent one, and probably one of the most important ones we see in the ITU, apart from the usual internet governance rumbles, has been this attempt at a new TCP/IP protocol suggestion from Chinese ministries, including then Huawei, which of course is another extension of a debate that's been going on in China for a long time about basically digital identification. And that's a big issue. It's not getting the international attention or media attention yet, but it is a big issue which will keep emerging. When one goes inside the ILO, for instance, there's been more consensus around the future of work. OECD, I'd say probably similarly the same. When one looks at the regional organisations, with the exception of the European Union, which is a unique body, the interesting thing at the regional organisations is they have very much focused on skill development. So I was looking at Mercosur, look at ASEAN, look at African Union, Commonwealth, etc., APEC even. The big focus is around skills development, which could also be a reference, especially in APEC and even ASEAN, around what is you can get consensus on, but that's been the main focus. Nicholas went through some of the aspects of the history of the G20, and I don't want to, my paper talks to that in some more detail, so I suggest strongly suggest you read it. And there is quite a growth of set of principles that people have come around to agree to since 2015. And usefully, I think for an Italian presidency, one can tie a lot of issues back to the Beijing or the Chinese presidency. And I think that will be politically useful going forward to be able to say there's an intellectual history between what was said in China in 2015 and what may be talked about in 2021. Because without, again, telling people things that are pretty obvious, but there's an Australian who works for a Canadian think tank, normally based in New York, but it's presently in Australia. We see the increasing division between the United States and China across nearly every issue, and at the peak of that is technology. This discussion of a potentially emerging technological Cold War. And so being able to find ways inside the G20 to actually partly alleviate that and can get some consensus around objectives, I think I would say is the number one priority. That's the number one priority, because the G20 has actually been an area where there has been some consensus growing. Even if it's aspirational, and trying to keep the very increasingly harsh splits that have been in the technological space that have been taking place in the last 6 months from poisoning too much of the G20 agenda, I think would probably be the number one priority if I was looking at the presidency now. I agree with Nicholas's progression of the number of issues in there, and both the artificial intelligence and the data processes. I would also point out that a number of occasions that the labour and employment ministers and the trade ministers have also engaged with digital economy ministers. And I would think that's actually a very good outcome, something people should think more of how do you get joint statements out of groups where the technology and labour interacts, or the technology and trade interacts. I think there's some usefulness in that. I mean, trade might be a difficult one again, but trying to keep people sort of engaged around a common set of aspirations, I think, is important. So the paper's 15 pages long. I'm not going to go through all of those at all. And we've talked about some of the aspirations coming out of Saudi Arabia. I think I want to come back to the G20 principles on artificial intelligence. But one of the observations I would make is that I suspect that certainly people I know in the OECD circles, and I might ask the OECD to speak to this, but people around that process were somewhat surprised to see the G20 adopt the principles to the degree that they did. And I wouldn't be surprised to see, some people saying, well, are the more data sovereign nations going to maintain their adherence to those G20 principles when they come to realize what they might actually mean? Again, I come back to the point that because you can draw a line back to some of the discussions under the Chinese presidency, you can actually draw a line for everybody being involved in discussions around this. I was quite involved with a set of principles around artificial intelligence from the T20 group in Argentina into the G20. And so I can say that it was discussed intensively in Buenos Aires before it even got to Tokyo. So I just point out that there's an opportunity to try to keep people linked in. I think it's a big objective should be around trying to keep people committed to the G20 principles of artificial intelligence, as well as looking at how to put them in place. Before I come to other sort of points that I'd be suggesting for the Italian presidency, there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a big impact on what the new normal will be. There is that whole surge in teleworking we have seen, and that is going to have an impact, at least in developed countries, on workplace structures, frankly, the role of middle management, or the threat to the role of middle management. How much people need to come to work or don't come to offices. A lot of that sort of practical. What does it mean then for childcare? What does it mean for support for people if they're finding themselves increasingly working from home? Some people are going to like that, others are not. There's a whole series of sort of very quite practical questions that are going to emerge out of the teleworking explosion. I think the other issue that's definitely coming up is increased surveillance of consumers and employees. And that's a big issue that needs to be addressed, and certainly from a European perspective. Is a worker's data going to be treated as personal data for privacy purposes or not? I think that's a significant question to be thought of. Again, partly from a GDPR perspective, but more broadly, is workers' data going to be, now workers are online all the time, is all their data going to be sort of personal data for the privacy rules or not? We've talked about the impact on potential jobs, and I think we're going to continue to see this national digital economy, digital technology policies battle, and the narrative around that continue coming out of COVID-19. Excuse me. Just some observations around the role of the G20 and going forward. I think there's two principles I'd say that are important. One is, and this is kind of counterintuitive to many, the G20, when it comes to digital economy issues, has not been trying to set rules. Rather, it's been trying to make statements of aspiration, which are explicitly non-binding. I actually think that's incredibly valuable. That's valuable going forward. I know there are voices that would like to see the G20 be more binding organization, and points to what's happened after the 2008 and its role in finance. I'm not going to doubt that. But I think in this area where we're increasingly looking at technological competition at the great state level, I think it's very important to have a place where we can get people to have some consensus, and we're more likely to get some consensus where it's around aspirational, non-binding, than forcing governments to come to a binding situation. So you know, I'm normally in favor of rules, and I will call for sort of rules in many places, but this one, I think we need to be careful. I also think for the presidency, for anyone coming into the presidency, there's a lot of history of what happens in places like the Digital Economy Task Force. One of the definite problems with the G20 is, well, problems, challenges. It doesn't have an obvious place for corporate memory. And I'm going to make some suggestions for that. There have been calls for this, for there to be you know, a secretariat, and I want to come back to that. Two other aspects about the G20 I think are important. The leadership of a particular presidency has a particular impact. It's got a very important impact. And so, you know, the country that is the presidency, probably in ways more than I've seen in, say, the European Union, I think the presidency really does define each G20 in a more significant way. And therefore, it's an opportunity for Italy really to have a significant impact on the agenda going forward. Secondly, because of the small scale of the G20, one doesn't find the sort of, at least my experience of watching it, one doesn't find the same degree of competition for, you know, countries to follow great powers that we see in the UN context. I mean, like the cybercrime and cyber norms debate has been clearly, you know, two groupings appealing to a third grouping, come and join me, sort of thing. You don't have that so much in the G20. So let me come to the three or four things that I'd be saying, recommending that the Italian president should think about. One is trying to work, and these are very practical ones. One is trying to ensure memory transfer. Now, I'm not going to agree with Sarkozy's proposal that there should be a secretariat from my perspective. Firstly, because I think there's a series of countries who will not accept that anyway. And secondly, because I think because of the role of the presidency with particular countries, it makes it frankly harder for the anti-globalization figures to attack the G20. It's very easy to attack the UN or other things because it's all these faceless bureaucrats who, you know, we've all heard the mantra, blah, blah, blah. It's much harder to attack a G20 because you're going to have to implicitly attack the country or the government that's hosting it that year. And there's a bigger political price to doing that. And so I think there's some benefit, ironically, of the G20 process continuing the way it is. The other side of the coin, though, I would say, is that there are certainly opportunities, I think, for some of the related organs of the G20, particularly the Think 20, the B20 and others, perhaps to play a role in just things like website preservation, maintaining lists of, you know, commissioned research, and you know, this is linking in the OECD as well. There's an issue of just maintaining long-term corporate memory that I think is important. Secondly, the Digital Economy Task Force, as we heard, was founded. It is my personal view that the task force should continue and probably should be solidified. There are some who've argued that it should be split up and sort of digital economy issues be in every one of the working groups. But I think there's value in actually keeping the task force together and potentially making it basically the same status as a working group. I think there's opportunity, I think, to expand interaction with the working groups. And I think on the artificial intelligence thing, a bigger point is actually the practical implementation of the principles. I think that's important. They're the main points I'd make for you know, some of the things facing the presidency in Italy.
Thank you very much, Paul. And we are gonna publish your paper very soon with the other papers produced within the project, and we're gonna collect them in a very short volume, and we're gonna send the paper and the volume to all the participants of this webinar so they can have a look at your very interesting and comprehensive paper. So now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Marjorie Buscher, who is Executive Director, Digital Society at Chatham House, and you can share the screen so you can see your presentation. Thank you, Marjorie.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you for the IAI for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to see, do you all see the presentation?
Yes, perfectly, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So Nicola Pino said it, there are many benefits, but also challenges of digitalization. I want to focus on three specific ones this morning where I think international cooperation could really help tackle and help address those specific issues. So I think it's useful to take a step back and remind ourselves that in April this year, about half of humanity was under some form of lockdown. And then as a result, we essentially had no choice to shift a lot of our activities, should it be social, political, or economic, online. And to give you a sense of the scale, and I think Nicola has had a graph on that, but at the peak of demand, 300 million individual logged on Zoom in a single day. It's the equivalent of the US population joining the platform in one single day. And so essentially the health crisis really has fast forwarded the process of digitalization and has enabled a mass adoption of digital technology at an institutional but also individual level. And what it has done as well is obviously accelerated and maybe magnify some of the trends associated with this process. The first one I want to highlight is our deepened dependence to big technology companies. And essentially, and I think Nicola also mentioned that to some extent, the big winner of the crisis are in the Western world, essentially GAFAM, which is Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook, and Chinese counterpart as well. And it's not only in terms of adoption of their tools, but also, as you can see in this graph, market capitalization gain and the number of staff they hire. If you take Amazon, only from the beginning of this year, they hire about 200,000 new individuals just to tackle the coronavirus-induced demand. And I think this is an important area for international cooperation, and it's essentially how do you manage the influence of these big technology companies. Now, Microsoft has a digital ambassador and digital diplomacy program. So essentially they're having influence and power that often are much beyond the state level. The second, I think, important characteristic, and I'll go very quickly on this because Nicola highlighted it, is the digital gap between but also within country. And what we see is that it's essentially higher income groups that benefit the most from remote working. If you're a lower income worker, you essentially face the trade-off of either keeping your job but increasing your risk exposure to the virus, or losing your job and experiencing an income shock. And it's not only in terms of income, but this divide is obviously also affecting capacity to access e-health and education. And as Nicola mentioned, it's along not only economic line, but also gender and racial lines. Now, the third challenge I want to highlight, and this is something that Paul also mentioned, and I think that I want to spend a little bit more time on this one, because I think it's the most interesting for the purpose of this conversation, is the deep fragmentation of the digital space and what we call the splinternet. So this is a really, really simplified version of what the splinternet is. CGI, by the way, had done really great analysis of this by Wendy Ho, essentially. But what is interesting is that the crisis has widened the differences between nations that have privacy-preserving regulations and those that are flirting with digital authoritarianism. If you look at this, essentially what we see is that these techno-national regimes, which carry very different set of values and perspective on what privacy, transparency, state control, and inclusion should be. And this has potentially profound consequences for our geopolitical landscape, because we're potentially heading towards a situation where our digital worlds will be incompatible and potentially collide. And in the last few years, we've seen a number of initiatives trying to sort of bridge this gap. I just highlighted this one, which is the UN Secretary General Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, that was released in June this year. And it is quite an ambition and quite far-reaching attempt for the UN to create new mechanism, new sort of bodies to tackle the technology governance. There's also quite strong normative vision around it, which is relatively new, but much more has to be done, essentially. And I think that looking at what the G20 should do, and I think Paul mentioned the normative power. And I think that's a very important element of this, because what international cooperation should focus on is essentially how do you increase inclusion, but also how do you create the normative foundation of a common digital world. I think the three elements that I highlighted here that I would recommend the G20 to consider is, first, what are the universal targets, definition, and metrics around our digital infrastructure? What is the notion of what is good digital connectivity? What is digital literacy? What is the minimum threshold for internet affordability? These are all questions that are really at the moment at the national level, debated at the national level, but we don't have universal target as we will have for SDGs. Nicola also mentioned inclusion, and what we see is in technology governance, the debate at the moment is a lot of big, powerful technical actors that dominate the discussion. Civil society, smaller states, and developing nations are really not as present as they should be. So what are the new mechanisms and the form of governance that would include the people that at the moment are not present is another key question. And finally, it's what Paul mentioned, is this normative power. What is the common affirmative model, the key values that the digital world should reflect? With that being fragmented as it's today, and the G20, because of its size and the nations that are part of it, could probably be a good place to start building these normative foundations. I'm going to stop there. This was, I hope it was not more than 7 minutes, Nicola. I hope to.
No, perfectly on time. Perfectly on time, Marjorie. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting conversation. And yeah, we should never forget inclusion and which model of digitalization we want in our world. So I would leave the floor to Andrea Gumina, Senior Policy Advisor to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you all. Thank you to IAI for having organized this very interesting webinar. And thank you, everyone, all my previous contributors for your contributions that are very interesting and that will be in my heart for the upcoming presidency preparation, I guess. So let me be very brief because we have a very few time and I'd like to point out at least three main topics in my presentation. The first one refers to the challenge of digitalization, and I would like to speak about innovation rather than digitalization, if I may. The other topic is how this challenge is changing after COVID-19, and finally, of course, what can be the role of G20. So let's start with the challenge of innovation. Let me bring some political rather than technological consideration to this conversation. I guess that the greatest political problem now is to how to put innovation again very high, not only in theoretical terms on governmental debate, but also at the people's level. Okay. How to put innovation out of the practitioner debate and allow it to become, as it was in 60s maybe, one of the key topics in people's debate. And this refers mainly to an objective and a subjective issue. The objective issue is that we need, as governments, to demonstrate that innovation has a striking role in making our real economies more productive, reactive to changes, as well as more resilient and sustainable. This is something that relates to the objective part of the topic. The other issue is subjective. I mean that we need to demonstrate that innovation has an attitude to not only not to threaten humans under any aspect. I mean, labor displacement, social cohesion and inclusion, right to choose, dignity, but also to proactively leverage their skills and capacity while preventing diseases and any kind of harms. And these are two messages that as government, we need to allow people understand and put into into their heart. Otherwise, I'm afraid that if innovation fails in demonstrating such attitudes, sooner or later taxpayers and government right after will lower the attention on investments on innovation, and finally it will lose our ability to put it very high on our political agenda. So this is the very, this is the framework where I move thinking about G20. How COVID-19 changed this scenario? Again, I guess that there are a theoretical answer and a practical one. The theoretical answer is that COVID-19 would have increased the room for global coordinated responses in terms of innovation. I mean, how to tackle challenges through innovation. And somehow it did, but again, not in people's perception. In practice, I see global efforts vanishing because every nation is moving more or less not in a coordinated way, at least in people's perception. Political attention diverted to very practical things like impact on real people's life, income support, unemployment, hospitals and vaccines. And what we failed maybe in transferring to people is that there is a strong linkage between short-term and long-term response, and this linkage is innovation. So if from a theoretical point of view, COVID-19 could have boosted the need for a coordinated response, maybe in practical terms, the perception of people, and I'd like to stress again this word, perception, didn't understand how innovation can help us in tackling these challenges, unless if you think about vaccines, okay, R&D and medical research. Let me briefly go to what can be the role of G20 in this scenario, despite the difficulties that are clear on any multilateral exercise in the last years. I think that, again, allow me not to concentrate on specific technological issues, okay? But rather than allow me to give some ideas on the political vision that we need to address, to put on the table. I guess that G20 should be a place to make innovation and digitalization really key priorities for the mankind as a whole. So this is the very first key message. In the last G7 presidency that Italy led in 2017, we introduced the human-centric, the people-centric innovation, and I guess that will be at the very heart of our exercise again. What does it mean? It means that we need a place where the debate is assured, is recurrent, is lasting, about how to anticipate innovation waves and their effects on people, on GDP, and maybe on the planet itself. So this can be one of the first roles of G20. Maybe we need to focus on a limited array of key supranational, multi-year, no partisan, reachable commitments that can see both private and public sector back them, and can represent something that integrate and add value to national policies. I mean, we need to focus on very, very few priorities, I guess. Finally, we need to find ways to proceed and monitor more smoothly the advancements of these priorities from one presidency to another. Because in my view, actually, there are too many options on the table, too many papers. I'd like to, I mean, with respect, too many issues that are debated within the task force or the Sherpa track, and very few ways of understanding and allow people to understand what is the impact of these issues on their life, on companies' life, how we can monitor them transparently, and how we can proceed from a presidency to another. So again, in my view, I think that the three priorities for G20, our G20 exercise, should be concentrated on everything that can accelerate the transmission belt between research, R&D, innovation, companies / public bodies, and people's life. So the transmission belt is crucial. Nicolas cited the Solus paradox in his presentation. I think that we are in the middle of the Solus paradox, and we have the responsibility to explain to our people how to be sure that this transmission belt is fostered by government action. The second one is that we need to definitely link investment in innovation in advanced and futurable technologies with a breakthrough in people's life, companies' competitiveness, and planet conditions. I mean, you cited a lot of technologies and a lot of issues, from AI to blockchain to smart mobility, whatever. But the very bottom line, from a political point of view, is to allow people clearly understand that any innovation brings value to their life and also to companies' competitiveness.
Sorry, Andrea, if you can conclude your presentation, please. Thank you.
Yes, the third and final issue is that we need to make innovation and digitalization become more equitable. And it means at least two things: investment and who will finance it. And the second one is how to avoid any kind of displacement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. And from Andrea Gomina to Andrea Renda, I know that you have a short presentation as well. So if you can share your screen so we can see it.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. Let me go directly into my screen. I hope you see my presentation right now.
Perfect.
We don't have much time, so I'll be very quick in thanking Istituto Affari Internazionali, a place where I have been also working in the past. I send my greetings also to my former director, now executive vice president, I think, Ettore Greco. Thank Nicola for the invitation, and thank all the speakers for a brilliant set of interventions. What I will do is just quickly reflect on how, as a scholar and as an advisor to a few institutions, I see the current situation in the digital economy. I think we've gradually come to a realization that the two main models that have emerged in the digital transformation, the American model and the Chinese model that have emerged so far, at the cost of oversimplifying and for the sake of time, have risen very powerful in a very powerful way, but they also shown signs of unsustainability. Both of them, more on the American side, if you wish. We've seen a rise in concentration and market power in the polarization of the economy. We've seen figures that really worry us also in terms of the current situation in terms of employment. We've seen the COVID-19 crisis, for example, leading to really a quick rise and a skyrocketing of the number of people on unemployment subsidies in just a few weeks. testifying of the level of stability of the jobs that are being created in a situation like this. So the key word in those models is polarization. The other key word is competition between these two models. There is an ongoing, and it's been quoted, rivalry between the United States and China. The ones that really want to criticize both models call it the rivalry between surveillance capitalism and authoritarian surveillance, if you wish, models. It is clear that also from a European perspective, this evolution has created, first of all, a focus on competition more than on the sustainability of the emerging model. And second, also has created a gradual polarization and concentration in the distribution of the value generated by the digital economy, which leads many real economy players and end users deprived of the value they originally generate. And that is something that has led to the following situations that you see in those quick bullet points. First of all, there is no obvious leadership at the global level on the responsible use of digital technology. The United States and China rather compete on applications that have, in most cases, very little to do with sustainability. The digital economy has some problems also in terms of its own environmental sustainability. Think about the energy consumption of data centers, think about e-waste, all things that need to be tackled proactively by governments if something is to happen at the global level. There's also an issue with social sustainability, not only because of the potential threats to fundamental rights, but also because of the impacts on the labor market. Just to give you a couple of figures, we are now using a platform called Zoom that is has a market valuation greater than that of US Airways, for example, but only has 2,500 employees. We are relying on digital platforms like Uber that have something like 20,000 employees around the world, but rely on 4 million drivers. So these are really small players, relatively speaking, that move an enormous economy. And typically, until now, they haven't been held responsible for the overall impacts of the bigger economy that they move. And this is something that will probably be on the table of the G20 as well. There is a forum shopping effect between superpowers. You go to the G7 or you go to the G20, you try to solve issues in the OECD, but when China endorses the OECD process, then you move away into something else. There is a little bit of a moving target there as to what will be the final platform where the more meaningful agreements on the future of the digital economy will be reached. And that is something I wanted to flag at the very beginning. And there is also something coming on the horizon that I think is going to be a game changer by the time Italy takes on its G20 presidency. It's something that has been relatively well interpreted by Commissioner Thierry Breton in the European Commission. The idea that we are now moving from the big first wave of user-generated data into a new wave of data generated by things, and the necessity to build, if AI and the cloud were the brain, to build a nervous system, to build bones and muscles for the digital economy in what will lead intelligence to become more and more decentralized, and what we call the edge cloud model and the skyrocketing figures on the Internet of Things, reaching several hundred billion connected devices in the next decade. In all this, in this overwhelming amount of data, it's not really the availability of data, but actually the ability to trust data flows that really becomes a new oil. I never liked the expression data is a new oil. I don't think oil has always been a blessing for countries in any case, but also in this case, it's not really the amount of data, especially if you think about ongoing evolution such as extended reality or the issues such as deepfakes, but actually the possibility of trusting the environment in which one operates that will make the difference. And here there's a growing temptation with all the deteriorating trust between superpowers and the increasing critical nature of the infrastructure. The temptation is to build more tech sovereignty. Now, what is not clear, in particular in the position of the European Union, where of course Italy will be nested when it takes on the presidency of the G20. This idea of strategic autonomy and technological sovereignty is interpreted by some people as being a sign of new independence or a new autonomy in the global sphere, by others as a way to sort of ring fence and strengthen Europe's position with a view to becoming a stronger negotiator in the years to come. So if you take the typical layered architecture of the internet that we use, that I'm not going to describe, a key evolution that we are seeing that, in my opinion, will be important in the years to come is the following. If you take, the darker layers as being the hardware, the tangible things, and then gradually the higher layers has been the software parts, depending each on the lower one, you have a situation in which the US is clearly specialized over time in the platforms, in the applications, in the development of content, but has realized with this new wave of technological evolution that the US has missed the train of 5G, has missed the train of the Internet of Things. Whereas Europe finds itself relatively well positioned, especially on 5G, and to some extent also in infrastructure. And this is also part of the past policies, and in particular in the regulatory frameworks in which the US has largely left infrastructure deployment unregulated, and has actually focused much more on investment than on competition. So one of the bouncing back effects of this is we have now a complementarity between these two players that didn't exist before. And they have to face a player, China, which has no complementarity needed because it is self-sufficient in almost all respects. So you will have seen, probably noticed in the past, the US interest in companies like Nokia, of course, the EU wishing to regulate US platforms. I think all this is creating a new space for transatlantic dialogue and a new setting that will be the core based on which global governance will evolve in the digital technology. There is a resurgence of transatlantic dialogue in this field. Now, when it comes to the global governance, this leads to, in particular on the AI field, to three different scenarios that we see. The splinternet has already been mentioned by Marjorie, so I will not define it in detail anymore. There is an emerging global partnership on AI, which is still largely G7 and backed as a secretariat by the OECD, but increasingly a process where China and Russia might be attracted over time. So there is an increasing incentive on the side of the US to create a smaller group, called, as of now, informally Worldwide Trust Network, which would exclude Russia and China from the creation of what the Japanese would call free flow of data with trust, with enhanced other features. Now, all this is interesting, meaning just to give you an anecdotal evidence of what I went through over the past 3-4 days. Of course, discussion on the global partnership of AI, where global largely currently excludes China. And the offer I got to organize a global forum on AI in September, October, where global, proposal coming from China, means EU, China, and a few other countries, but certainly not the US. So final slide to reassure Nicola. What are the topics for the Italian strategy that we see? Well, in my opinion, there is a lack of leadership on, as Andrea Gumina was saying as well, or relating technological development to actual concrete outcomes and impacts on people's lives. I don't see it likely that the Italian presidency will be able to adopt in the G20 a full-fledged SDG strategy because of problems with the quality of institutions, rule of law, to some extent other SDGs, but an SDG minus agenda, which is very similar to, if you wish, what the European Commission is doing in the Green Deal, meaning depriving the SDGs of some of its more controversial aspects where maybe the European Commission has lower actorness, such as the rule of law, but still pushing on the environmental transition and just transition, which means social dimensions. To some extent, the recently released Italian strategy goes exactly in that direction. Pushing the International Alliance for Human-Centric or Trustworthy AI, which echoes a process in which I have been heavily involved, which is the European Union high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, which basically terminates its work today and will publish its deliverables tomorrow. And this is something that the European Commission will try to launch. I think Italy can be very instrumental in this respect. Platform regulation in the future of work. Next year, I will also be involved in the release of the World Economic and Social Outlook of the ILO. There will be important empirical evidence that really urges intervention at the global level on the quality of work, especially on SDG 8 in particular, and the quality of work and the future of work in general, including skills. Data governance and strategy, where the EU is currently creating a system that is worrying many other superpowers, which is the data strategy, the cloud federation, the new concept of data spaces, which in principle would lead to much more sovereignty, much less osmosis, if you wish, between the data flows in Europe and in other parts of the world. Inevitably and increasingly tackling online content disinformation and the rising use of AI techniques such as generative adversarial network to lead to important threats such as deepfakes, and more generally stepping up cooperation on cybersecurity, which is, in my opinion, highly needed, and COVID-19 is really leading to an increased emergency in this respect, especially because of the rising rivalry between the US and China.
Sorry,
the Italian this closes my presentation. Just want to flag that we published the Italian strategy. The Minister of Economic Development published this strategy for artificial intelligence, in which I have been also involved as one of the 30 experts. I think it's a very good strategy. I think it's a very forward-looking strategy, and I think it could be also a blueprint for how the whole approach to the digital transformation might be shaped by the Italian G20 presidency. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. And yes, please, maybe you can type in the chat the link to download the Italian strategy. I think it could be very useful for many of us. So I'm going to leave the floor to our last speaker. So as you normally say, last but not least, it's my pleasure to leave the floor to Maria Joao Rodriguez, President of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and good morning, everybody. Well, I will not use PowerPoints, and I would make very straight to the point messages, because that, we know that we are running out of time. Look, I'm building on what my colleagues just said. And I'm trying to respond to Andrea Gumina's special call. Let's imagine an agenda which is starting from people's needs. And I do think that the new phase of the digital revolution has a great potential to respond to people's needs. And the starting point for us would be to be clear about this. We need to be clear about what can be provided by this new phase of the digital revolution. And in fact, we can push forward for the SDGs agenda in the different areas. But because of the COVID context, I'll put a particular emphasis on access to healthy life, to jobs, and to a green transition. And the digital revolution can be extremely helpful to provide these three things: healthy life, jobs, and green transition. Secondly, we need to be clear on the how. And the how, I completely agree with Andrea, is based on innovation. We need to encourage all these countries to adapt their innovation policy to focus on these needs and support innovation by all the relevant companies, particularly SMEs, because they are lagging behind. And we need to direct this digital revolution in the right way when it comes data flows, when it comes the kind of algorithms in artificial intelligence, when it comes our way to use Internet of Things. These are major innovations taking place now, but they need to be shaped in the right way, exactly to respond to these people's needs. So for me, this would be a big goal for the G20 and the Italian presidency. And then we also need to respond to the question, for whom and with whom? For whom this means that it's crucial to ensure universal connectivity. And we are very far from this. There is a big divide all over the world about the access to internet, particularly new generations of internet. And we need to respond also to the question, with whom? And with whom, this is about education, providing skills for many workers to join this new wave of the digital revolution. And again, we have a big deficit on this. There is also a very sensitive point, which is the social conditions for these new jobs. Because this means that we'll have more and more platform workers, and we need to update our welfare systems to cope with this new situation, when ensure that all these platform workers, they keep some fundamental social rights. So this will be my plea, but then we can ask, how is global governance in conditions to deal with this? And look, my assumption is that, yes, we have strategic competition, but basically I see not just two models, I see at least three models. There is the American model, there is a Chinese model, but European model is different on several points. My wish for the G20 is that the G20 is able to launch a process of convergence based on what we call in Europe open method of coordination, meaning even when we have big differences, we need to start from identifying the common challenges, what should be common priorities, and translate these into national policies, national plans, and then to organize a proper monitoring and learning phase. This is the kind of things which can be done by the G20. And the Italian president is in good conditions to launch this, using the COVID crisis as a leverage to go further in shaping the next phase of the digital revolution. There is a second thing which will come, is that over the next months, most of the countries will be busy preparing recovery plans to respond to the COVID. So we need to shape these recovery plans, I think, in this direction. And of course, the big question is how to finance this. But again, I think the G20 can use its clout to encourage World Bank, IMF, WTO, including, in the good direction. So promoting, shaping the potential of the next phase of digital revolution in the good direction. So this is my plea, and I conclude.
Thank you very much to Maria Rodriguez, Maria Joao Rodriguez for keeping on the clock. We are already late, so I'm very sorry if we cannot address any question. I'm just gonna leave the floor for a very brief final remarks to Piercarlo Paduan, that supposedly is connected, is the EI Vice President. Yes, thank you, Piercarlo. If you can give a very quick final remarks, because we are already late on the clock. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I was been listening to all the interventions very carefully, and I found this conversation fascinating, very stimulating, and impossible to conclude, actually. Maria Joao already mentioned some of the big points that the next G20 presidency, the Italian presidency, should put on the table, and I fully agree with her. So let me just reiterate what I got out of this discussion. First of all, that of course, the COVID-19 has accelerated a transformation which was already very much ongoing, and was also one of the parts of the European Commission strategic initiative in terms of digital transformation, along with the sustainable transformation. So this fits well, only it accelerates times. I am very much in agreement with those that underline the need to have a strategy that is inclusive, given that the risk of digital divide is still very high in terms of jobs, and again, that the COVID crisis may have accelerated that. But coming and concluding on the G20, the G20 is now facing new challenges. Let's remind ourselves that the G20 at the leaders level was established because to respond to a global financial crisis. We are now in the middle of a new crisis, which is to some extent more difficult to handle and which implies even deeper transformations in global governance. And if I were to take one element that is common to many of the interventions, is that on the one hand, as the economists say, this digital transformation is a big opportunity. At the same time, it's a big threat in terms of avoiding divide, providing inclusiveness, and also looking forward to a new global governance, which is absolutely necessary given one of the facts that many speakers highlighted, is to say that there are different geopolitical strategic models to deal with in the world today, to deal with the digital transformation. China, US, and Europe are many, but possibly others, sub-model as well. So there is a big need, a big implicit demand for global cooperation, which is generated by the technology itself. And I think that the G20, the Italian presidency, should be very clear about putting this on the table. It's a big challenge. It will not go away. Will not be addressed completely in the next G20 presidency, but the G20 presidency must understand that we are in a new world and that there is a new demand for global governance. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to Piercarlo Paudan, IAI's Vice President, and thank you very much again to the Italian Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and to Compagnia di Sanpaolo. Thank you very much to our speakers for their very interesting presentations. I hope this is just one or maybe the first kickoff event in light of the Italian presidency. And I hope there are gonna be further occasion to speak and talk about digitalization, especially because right now in time of COVID-19, digitalization is gonna be a hot topic. So I would like to thank you all participants again and have a nice day. Hope to connect with you very soon. Thank you very much.